I've been asked to respond to the question, which is this. Imagine a scenario in which a student says, there's so much evil in the world, God cannot exist. How would you as a professor respond? Well, I've had this experience and I've responded probably in a variety of ways. But I want to bring to this reflection two ideas. One is to probably follow the student comment with a series of questions. One set of those questions would be, what are you thinking of right now when you say there is so much evil in the world? What's your experience of that evil? And in some ways, it might be a very general statement that the student makes, that we all make, on the human situation. We remember what happened at Hiroshima. We're mindful of the Holocaust. We're aware of suffering of people, good people, as Rabbi Kushner reminded us, whose lives are lives of deprivation and hunger and starvation. We look at those different manifestations of evil. But my reason for inviting you as you're listening, or a student I might be talking to think about this, is really to get a handle on what the most recent trigger for the reflection is. What we think about is so much rooted, isn't it, in our own experience. But having asked that question about what are you thinking of? How do you see that evil? How are you encountering it in your own life? I can't help but move to the next part of that observation. Because there is so much evil, God cannot exist. That's a reflection, an observation that really invites us to think about how it is that we envision God. And so the conversation becomes the conversation about what's God like? Who's God? Who's God for you? What have you learned about God? And what is it in your understanding of God that raises with a particular intensity the apparent contradiction? God is good, evil in the world cannot be. I think sometimes when we begin to reflect on our images of God, we're not only aware of how impoverished those images are, how difficult it is to talk about the reality of God, how God is beyond language, but how often also we try to contain the mystery that is God and package it in a way that we can understand. I think it was Sheila Cassidy who remarked about a teacup God. She said that some of us feel much more comfortable with a God that we can put into a teacup. In other words, that great mystery now gets shrunken down to some manageable and containable size. Another way of reflecting about that idea of the mystery and of the understanding that we have of God is to ask the question of ourselves whether we have an idea of God that God doesn't measure up to, because it's an idea of what we would be like if we were God. It sounds funny, doesn't it? But I think that there's some truth in that observation. That we imagine that some terrible thing happens that brings incredible suffering to people, and maybe it's a natural disaster. And we imagine a God who is in the heavens, presumably. This God is always in the heavens, who is a kind of puppet master, or maybe a webmaster, or a computer specialist, somebody who's managing this great computer in the sky. And if only God had gotten God's act together, maybe this particular incident would have been averted. That's what I mean by encountering the mystery feeling uncomfortable about it and trying to cut God down to size, bring God down to a level that we can imagine. Now, I know that every time people talk about God and evil in the same sentence, they talk about mystery, and it sounds like a cop-out, doesn't it? But perhaps it's the only way in which we talk about mystery, but not mystery in the idea of a solution to a problem if we only look far enough, but mystery as that dimension of reality so big, so much beyond us that we can only begin to glimpse something of it. There's one other thing that I think I'd like to say about this issue of the relationship between the evil in the world and the suggestion then that God cannot exist. And that is that for me that statement becomes a real challenge to look at in very concrete ways the evil that is not mysterious in its origin at all, but is in fact the effect of human doing. And so if we look to an enormously horrific atrocity, such as the Holocaust, and we say, well, how could God let this happen? We're also aware that human beings, by the choices that they make and that they made, contribute to this action. It's not God who is the cause, but humans who in their misuse of human freedom, who in their selfishness, who sometimes in their almost unimaginably evil choices move us as a human community in a direction that we can only mourn, regret, and choose to remember in order that we might make choices that diminish that evil.